welcome to the latest edition of the Pro Football Focus IDP podcast, The Nickel. Once again, I am your host, Walton Spurlin, and as we take a look back at Week 9 and look forward to Week 10, I am happy and honored to once again be joined by one of the most respected minds in all the IDP land, Mr. Ross Miles.
Thanks, Wally. Thank you very much. And it's always nice to talk again, and it's especially nice when we're both coming off the back of victories for our respective NFL franchises.
Oh yes, it was a fun Monday night game to watch. I had the night off work, so got to enjoy the whole game with the family, and it was nice to see the Lions take care of business in a game they really should have won.
Yeah, I mean, playing the Packers without Aaron Rodgers is definitely a bonus. It's hurting me in a few fantasy leagues, unfortunately. Rodgers is one of the times I actually invest in a quarterback.
Oh, I'm sure that hurt a lot of teams out there. And fortunately, I don't have Rodgers, or unfortunately, I don't have any quarterbacks as good as Rodgers either. So it's definitely helped my cause in quite a few leagues. So, all right, enough of the offensive side of the ball. You can't say we didn't give you a little bit of it. But now let's get to the juicy stuff that we love to talk about on this show on a weekly basis. And we'll start with our news, notes, and injuries section. And we touched on this, I believe, first topic a little bit last week, but I think it bears delving into again as the Chargers come off their bye week and expect to have middle linebacker Denzel Perryman back in the lineup. And that's going to have some fantasy ramifications, I think, Ross.
Yeah, it should do. I mean, we are expecting him to plug straight back in the middle. The Chargers have been having issues at linebacker. We've certainly seen multiple names fill that spot. We thought we'd found a potential good one in Tavius Brown, but he hasn't quite lived up to expectation over the last few weeks. Obviously, he didn't play last week, as you say. But yeah, I mean, I think Perryman's going to plug straight back in. We talked more about it last week when we said how the safeties were starting to be subbed onto the field more in sub packages. So Perryman does have value, but I wouldn't get too carried away too quickly. I still want to see how that kind of scheme change is playing out.
That's good advice, and that's what I have down in my notes. I just jotted down Jatavis Brown, maybe with an arrow down. That's the way he's been trending. His snap count's been falling, even before Perryman comes back. And Hayes Pullard has played really well, but now we have to see exactly what his role may be moving forward. And I believe a wait-and-see approach might be the best solution when dealing with the San Diego linebacking situation until we see how it shakes out.
Yeah, that would make sense to me. And I think, keep an eye on Adrian Phillips, the strong safety as well.
Right, and speaking of safeties, we'll head to San Francisco now, and it's a little bit of a case of deja vu all over again, as strong safety Jaquiski Tartt suffered a broken forearm. I believe just a week after, Jimmy Ward had the same injury, broken forearm, and went on an injured reserve where, Tartt is more likely than not headed, so a team that could ill afford to lose young players in a rebuilding mode, the 49ers now are really suffering on defense, especially in the secondary.
They sure are, and Tartt's the kind of player you would pick up if you were an owner of Reed earlier in the season. He's been impressive. He's racked up points. His usage on the field has got him in the box, especially on running plays. So moving forward, you really want to key on who's going to replace him in that position. Now, during the game on Sunday, it was 7th round rookie Adrian Colbert, but I'm not sure that's how it's going to progress.
It's going to be very interesting to see exactly what they do, because that defense has been confounding for a couple of weeks now. If you look at that, like you said, Colbert came in for Tartt. Eric Reed is actually, if you look at Pro Football Focus, now being listed as a weak side linebacker. They've changed his designation, at least at our site. I'm not certain how many leagues have. There's a possibility they move Reed back to safety with these injuries occurring. And it's also interesting to try to figure out what's going on at the linebacker situation. We'll talk about Reuben Foster a little bit later, as he certainly had a nice week. But if you look at the snap count, last week, Ray Armstrong played 1 snap. And I have not been able to find anywhere that it was due to an injury that he didn't play.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting point about how they've been using Eric Reed. I believe they're going to probably switch him back to playing more of a traditional safety role. But as we've seen in the league in recent seasons, the use of Dion Buchanan and and Mark Barron, these kind of heavier hitting in the box safeties can make the transition down to playing weak side linebacker. I, I get the feeling from the news reports I've seen that they're going to abandon that because of the pure need at defensive back. But as we said, or I said, Tartt has been playing in the box. I think he's been playing up to like 87% of run snaps within 8 yards of a line of scrimmage over the last few weeks. So I would imagine Reed's role to be fairly similar, bearing in mind they had been using him at linebacker.
Right. That's what I would agree with. And so for me right now, and again, we'll touch on Reuben Foster coming up, but to me, he's the safest play moving forward. Again, sort of like the San Diego or Los Angeles Chargers, excuse me, that we were talking about. We really need to see how this shakes out when the 49ers hit the field. And we'll stay with the safety position, and I'll let Ross take the lead on this as it has to do with his beloved Rams. They have to make some changes to their secondary.
They have, yes. Free safety Cody Davis has landed himself on injured reserve thanks to a thigh injury. He picked up the injury back in week 6 against the Jaguars over in London. Sorry, yeah, he picked up the injury in week 6 against the Jaguars and actually missed last week and the week before. Moving forwards, it looks like rookie Josh Johnson is going to be the one who takes over. He's been on the field quite a lot recently, and because of that, I think he's an interesting waiver wire pickup.
On grabbing stash idea, always good. Get out in front of the curve, as we've often mentioned here, and yeah, go ahead and look to get Johnson on your roster and see how he plays out in that position. And let's stay with the secondary here for one last bit of information, and that's that the Giants they suspended cornerback Janoris Jenkins for violation of team rules.
Yeah, it was an awkward one. The giant Janoris Jenkins would have been very up for the game. He playing against his former team in the Rams. I don't believe he's ever lost against the Rams since he's been away from us. So it's just interesting to see the Giants making such a move, bearing in mind their record. This is one of their better players on defense. So the fact they're putting a marker in the sand. Personally, I get the feeling that McAdoo's on his way out. That and normally when the head coach goes, and quite a lot of the staff goes too. So taking this, when you're fighting for your job, essentially, I'm not sure how, benching one of your best players is going to help. But then again, maybe part of the reason they're struggling is discipline. It's a difficult one to really break down unless we're inside the locker room.
Exactly, and I believe earlier this season, didn't they suspend Rogers Camardi for a game or so? So something's going on there, and I think I actually did see earlier today that, and you mentioned in your notes that he probably wouldn't, this indefinite suspension probably wouldn't last very long, and he did miss week 9. I believe I read earlier where he's already been reinstated. So I guess we'll probably be seeing Jenkins back on the field this week, and we'll see how it plays out in what's become a very dismal season for the Giants. And I wouldn't be surprised, as you mentioned, if McAdoo doesn't not survive this sort of train wreck of a season. So that's our news, notes, and injuries. Now we'll delve into the positions and how some guys had really good weeks, other guys not so much. And we'll start with the defensive linemen and kind of a down week for the entire position. Eh, Ross?
Yeah, it really was. It took me by surprise when I was looking through the stat lines from last week, and only one player in the entire NFL had more than one sack last week. That player being a player who has been in exceptional form, Cameron Jordan.
Yeah, he's that Saints defense in general actually has been playing pretty well. I kind of jump started, I believe, in that wild game they had against my beloved Lions, but he has definitely. Well, I think he has 7 on the season now, and he's been putting up decent tackle numbers. So Jordan's really been stepping things up, and another veteran who had kind of fallen off the radar that I believe we might have touched on it as somebody who could maybe help IDP squads, and he hasn't been doing that earlier in the season, but he might be having a bit of a turnaround, and that's Robert Ayers of the Buccaneers.
Yeah, he registered a sack and a forced fumble, adding 6 total tackles to it last week. But as you say, he really had been struggling to be fantasy relevant at all this season. Literally a dearth of players towards the top of the points charts this week. enabled his name to be mentioned. It wasn't, if you look on the whole of it, it's not really the most stellar of games. It's decent, but yeah, I mean, Ez is a player who is probably on the fringe of fantasy relevance, and this might push him back into being sort of at least rosterable for the foreseeable future. Whether I'd want to actually start him, I'd probably want to see a little bit more production from him on a consistent basis over the next few games.
Right, and as we've mentioned numerous times, the defensive line is not too deep. So if Ayers can continue to play well, and we need all the contributors we can at that position. It's nice to see him trending in the right direction anyway. And we only have 4 teams on a bye this week, and a quick look, none of them are really teams. They got Oakland, Philadelphia. Well, you've lost some pass rushers there, so perhaps if you're Eagles heavy, Ayers might be somebody to plug and play. And another guy who's been, speaking of plugging and playing, he's been plugging the holes and playing really well, and that's Aaron Donald, once again, of Ross's beloved Rams.
Yeah, he had a very dominant performance in the middle of the line. 3 total tackles, a sack, a forced fumble, and a fumble recovery. I thought he could have been credited with at least another half sack, and he had a sack, forced fumble taken away, no, sack and fumble recovery taken away by penalty. So he was really omnipresent in the middle of that line, and doing what Aaron Donald does. He's having another stellar season.
Yeah, it really helped, didn't it, getting him back onto that defense. And I mean, just look at what your Rams are doing, and especially after the season they had last year. So it's great to see Donald having that success. Hopefully, the winning that they're doing is going to keep getting the fans to come out there in Los Angeles. But again, we need help at the defensive line and someone else who is off to a slow start, but has seemed to kick it into gear, and he's performed for us in the past. That's Jarrell Casey has really been stepping up for the Titans of late.
Yeah, it definitely is beginning to form the picture that Casey was a little bit dinged up at the start of the season, which did slow his progress. So last week he recorded a sack and 5 total tackles, 2 of which were for a loss. So if you're in a scoring format that rewards such a thing, that was a bountiful score for you, I'm sure, from Casey. But, as we said, he's getting it turned around these last few weeks. All 3 of his sacks this year have come in the last 5 games. Now, I don't think he's really going to push back towards his fringe DR1 status, but you could definitely do worse than Casey right now. As we said, we've thinned some of the numbers at the defensive line position this season due to injuries, a position that we already know isn't the deepest. So Casey is definitely pushing back into DL2 territory for me.
Right. Yeah. And it's nice to see because I believe you touched on it in one of our earlier podcasts. I think he was dealing with some injuries earlier in the season, and some owners might have given up on him, and hopefully you were able to snatch him off the waiver wire, and he's paying some dividends now. And we saw a streak come to an end last week, and it's still a player that's having an excellent season, and that I believe we still want to start on a weekly basis. But talk a little bit about DeMarcus Lawrence.
Yeah, Demarcus Lawrence, he had, 8 straight games of a sack, which is now ended, which was a bit of a shame. But yeah, he's still having a phenomenal season. He currently has 11 and leads the NFL along with Calais Campbell, a player who we were quite hot on before the start of the season. So the thing with Lawrence, I think, is worth reminding yourself is he didn't have a great fantasy day once he didn't get a sack. That's something with players like Calais Campbell who have a higher floor because of their tackle totals. You can depend on them that little bit more. So Lawrence, although he's been excellent, is showing he's more of the Cameron Wake kind of ilk, Jared Allen kind of ilk. If he doesn't get a sack, he can leave you with some lower points.
Yeah, yeah. And a younger player we can put in that list too that we've talked about a lot, and I just like to say his name, Yannick Ngakwe is sort of that same. He's in that same ilk. If he doesn't get the sack, the splash play, then his tackle numbers definitely aren't going to hold up enough for him to be a starter. So that's why he's one of those boomer bust players. And now let's take a look at some players that maybe owners are going to be looking to snatch off the waiver wire. And we've got a couple of guys here from the Philadelphia Eagles. I believe the 8-1 Philadelphia Eagles. Vinny Curry and rookie Derek Barnett.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, they are facing a bye week, so it increases your chances of getting one of these guys if they're still available. Both of them have really been productive when it comes to pass rushing in the last 4 weeks. I was having a just to look through some of the grades and some of the scores on the site. And one thing that really jumped out to me was how well the entire Philadelphia defensive line is playing. Obviously Brandon Graham's like the headline star. Chris Long's been churning up the stats and being somewhat productive. But when it comes to the guys that actually pin their ears back and really go after the passer, is Barnett and Curry, who you want to key in on now. Of the two, I think I'm going to say Barnett I prefer, but it is almost a coin flip. The reason I'm going to side with Barnett is purely because there's a bigger question mark about his true upside compared to Curry, who's been in the league for several seasons. But yeah, their stats are broken down really nicely over the last few weeks.
Right, and Curry, I know, has put up sacks in back-to-back games, which we like to see. I mean, he managed to do his damage last week while playing only 34 snaps, so got the bang for the buck there as far as snap wise. And let it never be said that we don't go deep diving here on the Nickel podcast when trying to help you out with some waiver wire ads. And Ross is going to touch on a player here from the aforementioned struggling New York Giants.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes at the position, we've talked about how it's shallow, so you do have to roll the dice sometimes, and sometimes, mid-season teams start to change things up, and we might have caught something here with Avery Moss of the Giants, the fifth rounder from this last season's draft, has had 10 total tackles in the last two games. He's added 2 hits and 5 hurries over the last three. I just feel, like I said, the Giants are struggling this season. They're going to be feeling out the fringe of the roster. They're going to try and find if there's anyone who can make them a play. And also, if you're the general manager, you've got to be thinking, if we're cleaning out the staff, who are the players that they brought in? Should they still be here moving forward? Are they part of the problem or part of the solution? So I think we'll see some fringe roster players, get the tires kicked on them. And Avery Moss could be one of those guys. If he's on the field, he's shown he can make tackles, and that's something you always want from a defensive lineman.
Exactly, and you consider the fact that Olivier Vernon has been out since week 4 with an ankle injury, and so yeah, players like Moss are going to get an extended look. Maybe at what point, when you're the Giants and the season's gone the way it has, do you just go ahead and say, you know what, we may just keep Olivier Vernon out, let him rehab that ankle to 100%, and if that means the rest of the season, well, we'd rather have him healthy as an organization, heading into 2018 than risk further injuring that ankle in what's quickly become a lost season in 2017.
Sure, I mean, yeah, Vernon is one of those players who hasn't really lived up to his paycheck in New York. So it'd be very interesting to see how the franchise deals with him moving forward.
Right, right. And speaking of living up to paychecks, let's move on to the linebacker position where quite a few familiar names lived up to their billing and had big weeks. And we can go ahead and start with Bobby Wagner, one of our top ranked linebackers, I'm sure, last week. I know he was for me. I'm sure he was for you as well, Ross. But he definitely gave fantasy owners all they were looking for.
Yes, he did. He got one of the most important plays in fantasy football, at least if you play in the scoring systems that Jeff and I devised several years ago, and that was a 10-point or an 8-point fantasy safety. You love that. Or normally it comes on a sack, so that increases the value. So yeah, Bobby Wagner with 12 total tackles, 10 of which were solo, padded it with, like I said, a sack safety. Impressive. I know I've seen him score over 30 in some of the leagues I play in because of those numbers. And what made it even more interesting was the fact that he was on the field for all 100% of snaps, which we do expect, but that was despite being a questionable player coming into the game because of his just being dinged up a little bit.
Right, durability is something that we love in linebackers, and Wagner certainly displayed that last week. And a couple of Broncos were on display, well, having big games in what was a sort of a beatdown there, I believe, against the Eagles. But Von Miller does what he does, and Brandon Marshall stepped up and put together a really nice week.
Yeah, I mean, as part of what being a good IDP gamer is, you need to be able to understand the dynamics of teams that win or lose. Now, Von Miller and Brandon Marshall have been fairly solid for IDP owners through the years just because of being good players. But in this instance, their points came because of the fact that they were given a bit of a hiding by the Chargers. Von Miller, 8 total tackles, a sack and a forced fumble. I believe his sack didn't come on Philip Rivers, I want to say. I think it when they brought a backup in. And Sean Lee, so I know I'm going too far down the list. Brandon Marshall also added a sack and a fumble recovery touchdown again. The game was dead by that point. The Broncos were well out of it, but it definitely padded his fantasy stats.
Right, and I think both those players actually, and we'll talk matchups a little bit later on. I don't want to give away too much, but I believe they play the Patriots this week, and the Patriots have been a little bit generous to linebackers. So that I hope I'm not stepping on any. I don't know if we have that mentioned, but anyway, that's a couple of names I like next week, and then Ross, of course, will touch on his matchups, and Ross touched a little bit on Sean Lee, the veteran, managed to put up his first double-digit tackle game of the season last week.
Yeah, that's a really surprising thing to hear you talk about when we talk about Sean Lee. This is a guy who, throughout the years, when he's healthy, has been a bit of a tackle monster. Yeah, he is a dynamic playmaker, but the 12 total tackles he registered this week is something I would normally expect to see littered across his score chart for the season.
Yeah, it's a little bit interesting. Yeah, that it took until week 9 for Lee to reach that plateau. But hey, I'm sure his owners are very happy that he did finally get there. And if you own Zach Brown of the Washington Redskins, then you've been happy for quite a few weeks, if not the entire season. And Brown just keeps continuing to churn out the nice numbers.
Yes, he does. 11 total tackles from Brown last week, which actually is the sixth time he's hit double-digit tackles this season, which is Vontae's perfect numbers in his pomp, really, which is quite incredible. I flicked over to NFL.com and noticed that his 86 total tackles on the season, which leads the NFL, is 10 clear, 10 whole tackles clear of his nearest competitor, CJ Mosley. Now, in any given week, we're happy with 10 tackles. Now, this guy's already 10 clear of his rivals at the halfway stage.
And exactly. And Mosley being on a bye this week, Brown's just going to have a chance to add to that. So, and I'll throw in as well his linebacking mate. Will Compton had a nice week last week against the Seahawks as well. I believe he finished with like 8 solos, and I had this jotted down because Compton jumped. 8 solos, 9 total, and an interception. So keep in mind the Seahawks were handing out the fantasy points to linebackers last week. And speaking of linebackers, just rolling along and picking up fantasy points, and I think we finally have our answer, as does Green Bay, who their man in the middle is going to be for the future, and that looks to be Blake Martinez.
Yeah, he's not getting mentioned in the waiver wire. It's part of the article or the podcast this week, but he is going to get a name check for top performances. Another 10 total tackle game, double digits in 5 of the last 6. He's actually fourth in the league with 74 total tackles. As you say, Wally, I think Green Bay have found the answer to who they want to use on the inside now.
Yep, now they just got to figure out some way to get Clay Matthews going in the rush game, because it surprised me to no end that he was pretty much a non-factor last night against the Lions, a team that has struggled enormously with edge rushers. And I don't know exactly what Green Bay's scheme was, but to me it seemed a little off kilter, because I would have just been lining up Clay Matthews. I mean, we were down to, I say we, the Lions were down to their 4th left tackle last night for a few plays, and they still weren't lining up Matthews outside to try to bring him off the edge. So I don't know what the Packers are doing there, but I do know that Blake Martinez is playing well, and you're going to want to make him a weekly start. And now we're going to talk about a couple of waiver wire additions that could really help your team. And the first one is Reuben Foster, who's been quite an enigma throughout his rookie season, mainly due to injuries. But he certainly stepped up last week in that muddled San Francisco linebacker situation.
Yeah, he put his marker in the sand, didn't he, with 14 total tackles last week. We did talk about him in the preseason when we were doing our rookie review, and I think we agreed he has LB1 potential, but the issue is, the mental game and potentially injuries, and injuries have been a major factor for him this season, having already missed 6 games. I do think he's a really hot pickup because, as we're saying, he's got LB1 potential. He could really mix it with the top point scorers in the game at linebacker. So it's very rare you can find someone like this on the waiver wire, even in their first season. But injuries have really plagued him. So if you like the idea of Foster, you're going to have to grab him this week if he's available.
Right, and as we touched on earlier, it appears that they're phasing out Ray Armstrong from the defense, and we don't know what they're going to do with Reed. That's a situation to monitor. I'm not saying you have to. If you've had Armstrong, I would wait to see how this week plays out. Excuse me, before dropping him, because if they kick Reed back to safety, then perhaps it's Armstrong that'll get back on the field. Although they didn't do it in the game last week, and Tartt only played 19 snaps before going out. So I would have kind of thought, well, if they're going to get Armstrong back at weak side perhaps and kick Reed to safety, they would have done it during that game. They didn't. So my advice, if you have the roster space, I would hold Armstrong. I would not start him, but I would hold him for one more week. And if we see the same type of snap count, obviously, he goes back to the waiver wire.
Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense, Wally. I think that's the approach you need to take. With dramatic changes in snap counts that we can't really put down to injury, I prefer just to wait an extra week just to make sure, unless you're really tight on bench space.
Right, and another name that we have here at the linebacker position, and I'm going to go ahead and pat myself on the back a little bit, as he was listed as a start option in my Week 9 start sit article for Pro Football Focus, just because I love the matchup and I love the way this guy's been playing all year. Wesley Woodyard of the Tennessee Titans.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think what I'm finding most interesting about this is a player who we probably thought was on the out in Tennessee. He is a very solid veteran who's been viable in fantasy leagues for a while now, but he only started 10 games last year, and there was the potential they were looking to replace him. But, fast forward to week 9 of, the next season, he played 100% of snaps in the last 3 games. He's had 30 total tackles over the last 3 games, including 14 last week. I think Woodyard has played himself back into a starting role here.
He certainly has, and he's just kind of personally been a player I've always liked. Linebackers out of University of Kentucky, they're sort of few and far between, although I do believe his teammate Avery Williamson, who's not really fantasy worthy, but I'll just mention that I believe he also played linebacker at Kentucky. So maybe there's the Kentucky to Tennessee pipeline. But anyway, it's nice to see Woodyard have a big week, and big week is going to transition us into the defensive back position, because there's another player for Tennessee who is had back-to-back really big weeks. Talk a little bit about Kevin Byard.
Yes, Kevin Byard, 2 interceptions to cap off the 3 he made last week, so that's 5 in 2 weeks, which I saw a piece of footage from the locker room, and believe they were saying that no Titan had ever made 5 interceptions in 2 games, so that was a franchise record. But the thing I really want to note here is he only had 4 total tackles, and he had the same last week. In fact, he hasn't had more than 5 total tackles since week 4. So I don't want to sort of burst too many bubbles here, but Bayard for me as a player, despite these interceptions, we want to be a little bit wary of. And I'll throw you a question, Wally. So on Twitter this week, I had someone ask me about Jonathan Cyprian, who's obviously just returned from injury. He's a regular DB1, I would say. He was asking me whether he should be used starting Cyprian or Bayard. I gave him my advice, but where would you sit on that one?
Well, so the question was before last week's game?
No, after.
Oh, after. Oh, let's see. Well, I would say now. My answer would have been different, because I actually had Cyprian listed as a sit in my start bench article last week, just until we see what his role was or how healthy he looked. Now, he didn't put up really big numbers, but he did play, I believe, 68 snaps. So for me, going forward, we know that Cyprian's going to be on the field a lot, and as you so rightly touched on with Bayard, that's really big play dependent with those tackle totals. So I believe I would have told the person I would go with Cyprian moving forward.
That is the advice I gave, and he was actually surprised. So I said, look, the reason I broke it down fairly similar to you, and I said, look, you look over Cyprian's career. This is a guy who's never failed to reach 100 total tackles in any given season. That's just a benchmark of points that I don't think Bayard can reach, based on his tackle totals at the minute. He's too big play dependent. That's not saying he isn't rosterable or even startable. I'm just saying if I was picking between Cyprian and Bayard, I'd definitely be falling on the side of Cyprian. I just don't think, for me, Bayard's a proper DB1. I know he's probably right up there in the rankings right now because of those 5 interceptions, but I would still only keep him in that kind of, moderate DB2 section, right in the middle there.
Right, and let me just clarify because I did have it jotted down. Actually, Cyprian played 62 snaps last week, but still illustrates the point. He finished with 2 total tackles, but to me, the more important number is the number of snaps that he played. It means he's back in a nearly every down role, and it will be moving forward. And he just said, yeah, Byard, definitely keep him on your team, but you're not going to make a living, especially in maybe balance scoring formats or just the standard formats that relying on multiple interception games in back-to-back weeks. Actually, if I had him and your trade deadline is still out there, I'd be shopping Byard right about now to see what you might be able to get for him, off of a couple of performances like that.
Oh, definitely. I love that play.
And speaking of loving the play, and one of my favorite sayings, and I sometimes take some grief for it, but as always, water finds its level. And Rashad Jones, he's been dinged up with injuries over the last couple of years, but now he's back to being Rashad Jones, and he had another big week last week, Ross.
He did 9 total tackles and an interception. I love Rashad Jones. He's one of my favourite players for fantasy purposes. He's just ultra consistent. He bangs in tackle after tackle every single week. He's averaging 6.9 tackles a game. And the thing that what pushes him over the edge for me is his splash plays. He continues to find a way to make a pick, get a sack, force a fumble. The guy just has a nose for the ball, let alone ball carriers. Love him. Absolutely love him. I feel bad now that I didn't rank him number one last week. I believe I had Collins above him, and I'm not going to make that mistake for the rest of the season.
I believe I might have had maybe even Keanu Neal above him, who we're about to touch on, but just again, maybe this is a little bit more love for Rashad Jones. If you just look quickly over his last 5 games, he's got 30 solos, half a sack, 3 passes defended, 2 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries. That's what you just touched on. This guy brings it all. The tackle numbers, the consistency, and, splash plays. So Rashad just keeps doing what he does. And Keanu Neal, we all loved him coming into the season, and he hasn't disappointed.
Agreed. He's really following on in the kind of Rashad Jones mantle. 8 total tackles, 2 forced fumble, and a recovery. You take a look over what he's been doing. This is a player who's recorded at least 7 total tackles in each of the last 5 games. So he's vaulting right up. I mean, we already had him towards the upper echelons of defensive backs, but for me, based on the fact Landon Collins isn't having the best of seasons, I reckon you could argue that Keanu Neal is making a case to be the number two behind Jones.
Absolutely. Absolutely no argument here for that. Neal having a very big season, and it's always nice when the preseason rankings or preseason evaluations that we put together just, stay right on track. Which brings me to the next player, Tyvon Branch, and I'll just be flat out honest with you. I didn't see this type of season coming for Branch, and I'll tell you what, Old Man River just keeps on putting up fantasy totals and NFL totals.
He does, and it puts a massive smile on my face. I almost want to contradict myself about talking about the number two defensive back in the league straight after saying it, because Branch is probably the player who I think would challenge for that spot with Neal. He's been incredible this season. It's great to see him rolling back the years, a player who suffered with injury, but he was exceptionally productive in his first few seasons in the league when he was an Oakland Raider, and 10 total tackles last week, the 4th time in this season he's been over 10. If Jones was my first pick, I would probably take Branch second, just purely because I love those tackle numbers.
Right, consistency is what we strive for, and Branch has certainly been consistent this season. I'll be honest, I was a little bit worried after I believe it was in their game against your Rams that actually, Antoine Bethea had put up nice tackle numbers, so I wanted to keep an eye on both of them this week. And Bethea went back to just only playing 46 snaps. 3 solo tackles was his line, and Branch played 74 snaps. So, Branch continues to be the man that we want starting on a weekly basis at safety for the Arizona Cardinals. Now let's look to the waiver wire. We touched on the rookie Johnson for your Rams.
Yeah, so I say we've touched on both of these guys really, so I think we can kind of just mention them in name really. Josh Johnson for the Rams, he's assumed free safety duties because of Cody Davis's injury. Reason we like him is he's had his best total tackle game last week with 7. He's playing a minimum of 80 snaps in each of 80% of snaps, in the last 4 games. I think he's a guy we just want to get on the roster. Whether you start him straight away is another question. And the second player, we potentially got slightly divergent opinions, but I think we both accept that Eric Reed has certainly put himself back on the fantasy radar. Whether we see him used essentially as a safety or a kind of a hybrid safety linebacker, I think he's probably going to assume the role Tart was playing. So for me, I think Eric Reed's someone you still want to grab and get back into the fantasy lineups.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not going to argue that. Like I said, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what the 49ers do, but they're going to have to do something with Reed. They just don't have the depth as a team to not have him on the field somewhere with all the injuries, Ward and Tart both going out. So Reed will be somewhere on the field with the opportunity to put up some tackles, as you mentioned, probably close to the line of scrimmage. So that's our look at positions. Now we'll look ahead to Week 10 and some matchups, some favorable matchups and not so favorable matchups. And we'll start with the edge rusher position. And right now, I believe there are a few. Who is it that you like here? Well, is it Aaron Donald, Robert Quinn, Connor Barwin in their matchup against the Houston Texans? Oh, how sad I was to see Deshaun Watson go out.
Ah, yeah, what a shame. To see his face on the sidelines during the game when Tom Savage just bonked that pass to win the game at the end. It just you could see how much he wanted to be out there. I could just understand that frustration of just watching someone just squander the opportunities you'd created for the team. But anyway, moving on. Houston, they're probably going to feel the wrath of the Rams pass rush this week. Now, Robert Quinn and Connor Barwin will be the primary beneficiaries, being edge rushers themselves. Obviously, it doesn't necessarily help you as they're linebackers in most systems, so you probably only want to consider them in big play scoring systems. But Aaron Donald, I know he comes from the interior, but he doesn't mind sort of swinging out when he can. So I do think this will be a plus matchup for Donald, although not, Quinn and Barwin are the prime beneficiaries here.
Right, yeah, Houston's going to be a team to target with edge rushers down the stretch here. I believe even once they make the move from Savage to TJ Yates, which I don't think is going to take very long because Savage is doing what he can to play himself out of that position. And another team struggling at the quarterback position that is a prime matchup for Trey Flowers is the Denver Broncos. So explain a little bit why we like Trey Flowers and maybe even another sneaky pick from the Patriots this week.
Yeah, I mean Trey Flowers is just a player I've been impressed with over the last season and a half. He's really come on, and I think this is the kind of game where he's going to have a bit of a feast. Trevor Simeon is not really getting it done for Denver. He's a little bit of static in the pocket. I'm kind of surprised they haven't switched to Paxton Lynch. Maybe that's doesn't bode well. No, sorry, they've also got Brock Osweild, haven't they now? So again, it still confuses me why they're not turning to Paxton Lynch. But if you do want to dig a little bit deeper for a Patriot pass rusher, perhaps consider Dietrich Wise.
Right, yeah, I think whoever lines up. And I think there is some talk that Lynch, I think what is a problem with Lynch is he's been battling a shoulder issue. But after watching Osweiler last week, who got his chance, did nothing, they got trounced. I know that it'll be sooner rather than later that they turn to Paxton Lynch. It might be too late for the Broncos on their season, but at least they'll get a chance to see what they have with the youngster. But I think what they're going to have this week is trouble protecting the quarterback, and I like that call of Flowers. I think, and I need that call of Flowers in quite a few leagues. I'll just be a little honest here. And a veteran coming off a down week but has a plus matchup is Cameron Wake of the Dolphins. Talk a little bit about why you like Wake this week.
Yeah, and the Panthers have been a great matchup for opposing edge rushers, and Wake is a player who's been a terror in the league for several seasons. He's been playing quite well this year, so I feel this is a matchup where he's going to continue to make hay. If you want to dig a little bit deeper, Andre Branch, I guess, is the name I'd probably look for. It is tough to find a second real threat on that Miami defensive line.
Right. I think they're hoping that the rookie Charles Harris will come along maybe towards the end of the season and have something to build on. Because let's face it, Wake's closer to the end of his great career than the beginning, so they're going to need some youth. But I like that call of Wake. And again, I've mentioned my man crush on Cameron Wake a few times on the podcast. So we're going to move on to some players we don't really have a crush on this week due to the matchups. And it's always tough going up against the Saints if you're looking to roll up big numbers for an edge rusher. So there's a couple of Buffalo Bills that we're not real high on.
Indeed, Shaq Lawson, probably the secondary of the two. I think you're going to definitely want to bench. And Jerry Hughes is a player I think who you're going to bench because I'm telling you it's a bad matchup. And I own him and started him last week in his matchup last week, and he scored zero. So going from a zero to one of the toughest, if not the toughest matchup for edge rushers doesn't bode well. He's got to ride the bench.
Right, and the Panthers, on the flip side of why we like Cameron Wake, on the flip side of that are Julius Peppers and Mario Addison, some edge rushers from the Panthers who are in a bit of a negative matchup.
They are, yeah. I mean, Addison and Peppers are probably both for me fringe fantasy players. Peppers has definitely moved forward this year with he's on 7.5 or 8 sacks now. So he is someone who would have, maybe parlayed that play into a start for a few teams, but this is not a great matchup for edge rushers. So you might want to rethink that strategy.
All right, and this could be a down week, and we've got about 5 minutes to go, so I'll pick up the pace on my end here. But could be a down week for a couple of the big names for the Chargers, Joey Bosa and Melvin Ingram.
Yes, Jacksonville have been a team to score points against for defensive linemen. Now, Bosa and Ingram to me are both top five defensive linemen, so I can't really envisage any situation where you need to bench them or will have to bench them unless you are an exceptionally shallow league or you only start one or maybe it's a league where you have any defensive designation and it's a big play league, so the kind of high scoring defensive ends come into, factor in sometimes. But generally speaking, Bosa and Ingram are insta starts every week. I'm just giving you the heads up. This isn't the best matchup, so maybe limit your expectations. If you really need to make upside plays this week, because you're on the fringes of qualifying for the playoffs and you're against a high-scoring rival, maybe if you want to try and pull some clutch, crazy play out, you could bench one of these guys. But generally speaking, it's a really tough thing to do.
Yeah, just as you mentioned, probably best to just temper your expectations, but there may not be better matchups out there or even on your roster if you have either one of those two. Some off the ball linebackers that have a plus matchup are a couple of New Orleans Saints against a very generous Buffalo offense when it comes to giving up points to the linebackers.
Indeed, indeed, and Craig Robertson and AJ Klein, two players I think that will perk a few ears. I would imagine both, if not one, at least will be on a waiver wire somewhere, unless you're in a crazy deep league. So, if you are someone who's been almost streaming linebackers, or you need a third viable linebacker this week, Robertson and Klein will definitely appeal in a very plus matchup against Buffalo.
Right, and a couple of Bengals we like, probably starting every week. Vontez Burfict, Nick Vigil.
Yeah, again, it's a good matchup, not the greatest. It's pretty high up there, but I just picked this one out. Perfect obviously has been a tackle machine, and Vigil is being very productive this season. If you're a Perfect owner, you've got to start him. If you're a Vigil owner and you are thinking about it, I think the matchup's good enough to start him over some slightly bigger names.
All right, we've got about 2 minutes left, so we're going to quickly touch on we like a couple of Steeler linebackers and we don't like a couple of Redskin linebackers. Or, I'm sorry, Minnesota linebackers.
Indeed, yeah. Ryan Shazier is a player who I thought maybe had a top end LB1 potential at times. He flashed it early season, but he hasn't quite lived up to it. He's still solid. He'll be good this week. Vince Williams is again another player we potentially expected more out of. He's doing okay. Again, this week is a time that you would want to start him. But as for the Vikings on the negative side, yeah, Eric Kendricks and Anthony Barr, Washington have not been a conducive matchup for points. So Kendricks is someone who you're probably going to need to start unless you're quite shallow, so to temper expectations. But Barr is a bench. And then one guy I really think a couple of more guys we need to mention who have been quite studly this season, Sean Lee and Demario Davis in their respective matchups against Atlanta and Tampa Bay. Be very wary. I think these are bad matchups and you might want to bench them if you can. The same goes for Darren Lee.
All right, yeah, those are tough matchups. Let's move quickly to some safeties, and rookie Jamal Adams could be in for a tough week against the Buccaneers. Oh, I'm sorry, in for a good week. Sorry, I went the other direction. Just because I've owned Jamal Adams and he hasn't exactly done what I'd love. But no, go ahead and talk about why you like him this week, Ross.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing I really noticed when looking at the point spread for the different offenses and defenses when it comes to safeties is that the spread isn't as big. When we've been talking matchups for linebacker and defensive end, the trend about what's a good and a bad matchup is a lot stronger. At safety, it's not so much. And if you're a Jamal Adams owner who hasn't been pleased with his scores, again, this is a slight plus, but he's had some good pluses in the last few weeks. So if he's not putting up the points for you, and it's a difficult one. I'm saying it's a good matchup, but he's a player I'm still tempering expectations on.
And we like a couple of Carolina safeties this week.
Yeah, the good old veteran Mike Adams. I always find a way to name drop him if I can. I like this matchup against Miami. Jay Cutler's not been the most accurate quarterbacks. And Kurt Coleman, we talked about Kevin Byard and his 3 interceptions. Now, I've remembered days when Kurt Coleman has had 3 interceptions in the game. Jay Cutler, maybe.
There you go. And there's 3 more defensive backs we're not too high on heading into this week. Go ahead and touch briefly on them, Ross.
Yeah, Keanu Neal, we talked him up earlier in the podcast, just giving you the heads up. It is a bad matchup in leagues where you can somehow have enough depth to replace him. Maybe you should consider it. And then Kenny Vaccaro and Von Bell again. Vaccaro's a fringe DB1 on a good day, I think. So, and in a negative matchup against Buffalo, I'd maybe temper my expectations again. Von Bell, he's definitely only a fringe starter at best. I would not be starting him this week.
And there you have it. Those are the matchups. Make sure you were taking notes, folks, because Ross is on the money with these matchups. You don't want to be late to that party. And speaking of parties, go ahead and close this one down until next week, Ross.
Indeed, Wally, it's been a pleasurable experience as always. Love doing the podcast, and hopefully we can continue some winning runs for both our franchises and start with the joie de vie of that next week. But until next time, adios amigos.